Generally, when we talk about the structure of a literature review, there are three parts. The first one is introduction. In this part, you have to mention that what is the topic of the literature review, and then more so you need to mention that why it is important to conduct this literature review. So you have to motivate the need for this review. The second part is main body. So in this part, you have to bring the meat of your study, which means that all the patterns, the insights, the different kind of consistencies or inconsistencies you find in the body of literature, you have to mention it in the main body. And lastly, conclusion. So here you need to sort of draw the map for future research in that field. I personally, when I'm reading a literature review, I mainly focus on the conclusion part or on the discussion part, where I can see that, okay, these researchers have studied, let's suppose, these 70, 80 papers in this field. What are their key findings? Where we can build further research on the top of the existing research. So I'm personally very much interested to read the discussion and the conclusion section of the literature review. Now, when we look at it from the research paper perspective, that what a literature review looks like when we publish it. So it has these different parts. It starts with an introduction. Then we have the background and related work. Now, it's important to note that in the related work section, we mention other literature reviews that are relevant to our literature review. And at that time, we try to position the novelty of our literature review, that how our literature review is new compared to existing literature reviews in that field of study. The next one is research methodology. So in this part, we describe how we have conducted this literature review so that the reviewers, they have confidence that this study is conducted in the right way. And then we go and we have the results. In the results section, as I mentioned, that we present the sort of classifications, the trends, the patterns, the insights from that field of study. Next, we have implications for researchers. So this is again a very important part of a literature review, that we identify gaps, that okay, where are the gaps in this particular field of study that future researchers can fill. Next, we have implications for practitioners. So in any field, like for example, if we take the field of, let's suppose, artificial intelligence, so there are findings that are relevant for researchers, and then there are findings that are relevant to practitioners. For example, there is a certain, let's suppose, security vulnerability that is common among many applications, AI applications, and that the practitioners need to be aware of. Next, we mention the limitations, which means that how certain aspects can threaten the validity of these findings. For example, in limitations, we can mention, or often it is mentioned, that it is possible that we might have missed a relevant primary study from this literature review. And then we conclude the literature review. As far as this webinar is concerned, so this is going to be our focus, which is research methodology. As I mentioned, that in order to focus on this part, we need to understand how, what exactly literature review is, and only then we can go and we can talk about that how to conduct a proper literature review. Now, the main part of this webinar, how to conduct a literature review. So these are the main steps. For example, we first need to identify the need for review, then go and define the research questions, then conduct a pilot study, design search string, define inclusion-exclusion criteria, select relevant studies, extract data, analyze and report data. So in the next 10-15 minutes, I will go and I'll talk about each of these steps, that how we can work on each of these steps within the methodology of literature review. So the first one is specify the need for the review. As I mentioned, that it is important that you have a solid motivation for conducting a literature review. Now, the purpose of literature review, it could be different. For example, for someone, it could be establishing a foundation for your own research. The next could be identifying gaps. Now, identifying gaps is one of the main reasons why many PhD students conduct literature reviews. So they understand a field of study, and then they go and they conduct literature review in that field to identify gaps. The third one is understanding trends. So as I mentioned that, for example, if you are doing a literature review in the field of artificial intelligence or say AI algorithms, so you can go and you can, for instance, conduct a literature review to see the trends that whether people use more. So for example, supervised learning or they use unsupervised learning algorithms. The next one is validating findings. So if you have findings, you can do a literature review to kind of compare whether the other literature, existing literature, they support or they contradict those findings. And lastly, about guiding direction. So if you are starting a big project and you want to first understand the field of that field and then guide your research accordingly, so you can also conduct a literature review. From the reviewer perspective, it is important that you have a solid reason and you have justification for that if you want to do literature review and then you want to publish it. Step 2 is defining the research questions. Now, this is one of the, I would say, the toughest part because it's very important that you define the right set of questions. If your questions are not good enough, sort of the rest of the effort would go in vain. So, and also for, especially for early career researchers, defining right set of questions, it's quite challenging. So for this purpose, what you have to do is that you need to properly collaborate with your supervisor or with your PhD advisor. Then you need to outline broader research topics. So you need to, in discussions, you have to first kind of narrow down that, okay, what topic you want to conduct a literature review on. Then you need to define initial research questions. Okay, then you need to go in more specific, become more specific. Then you need to scope your literature review. Now, it's again very important. I'll tell you, I have submitted literature reviews, and many times it happened to me that I get the comments that the scope of this literature review is not clear. Scope means that what is covered and what is not covered in this literature review. So you need to be careful about the scope and its clarification. And then you need to ensure that your questions are clear and targeted. For example, these are a couple of questions from one of my literature reviews that was published 2-3 years ago. So this is what research questions for a literature review look like in my field. It might be different in your field. Step 3 is conduct a pilot study. Now, what is pilot study? Pilot study is that you do a study but on a small scale. You don't go full scale. And you do it on a small scale to make sure that you are going in the right direction. So what happens is that in a pilot study, you try to identify 8 to 10 papers relevant to that field that you know basically that, yeah, these are very relevant to the topic. You assess the relevance, like as I mentioned, that you already know, and then you see that whether these papers are relevant to your research questions or not. If they are relevant and you can properly answer the questions, then that's fine, you can go ahead. If not, then you need to redefine your research questions. Step 4 is designing the search string. Now, this is more relevant in the context of literature reviews, like systematic literature reviews, where you are supposed to make sure that you do not miss any relevant paper. So you design a search string, like the one that is shown here is an example, and you run it through the databases that I mentioned, like for example, Scopus or Google Scholar or IEEE Explore. Then you see that whether the results are satisfactory or not, whether you are getting the papers that you already know that they are relevant. For example, as I mentioned that in pilot study, you already know that, okay, these 8 to 10 papers are relevant. Then if the search string is returning those papers, it means that your search string is correct. If it is not returning those papers, then you need to adjust your search string. Step 5 is define inclusion and exclusion criteria. Again, this part is important because you need to be clear that what is going to be part of your review and what is not going to be part of your review. In other terms, which papers are going to become the part of your literature review and which are not going to become part of your literature review. So, because what happens is that when you hit the search string, you get a very huge number of papers returned, right? Like for example, when I executed this search string shown in the previous slide, it returned around 4,500 papers. Now, it's not possible uh, to include 4,500 papers. That would take me maybe 3 years to read all those papers. So we have to define criteria that what is going to become part of our paper and which papers are not going to be part of our paper. For example, you can define that, okay, a paper that has only given some ideas, but they have not experimentally evaluated their ideas or proposed solution, they are not going to become part of my paper. Similarly, you can define the quality metric that a paper that is, for example, published in A rank journals or a high impact journals, only those papers are going to become part of my review. So you need to sort of define this criteria, and that would help you to narrow down the number of papers to be part of your literature review. Step 6 is selecting relevant studies. Now you have run the search string through the digital database. Then you have these papers returned, let's suppose 4,500 papers. You have defined the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now you have to pass all these 4,500 papers through that criteria to sort of end up with a small number but relevant studies for your literature review. So the steps are, for example, you run an automatic search that return papers, then you select studies based on titles, okay, because it's easy to read the title of a paper. Then you remove duplicates. What I mean by duplicates is that if you are running the search string on multiple databases, as you can see in this example that I ran the search string on 6 different databases like IEEE Explore, Scopus, Science Direct, and so on. Then you need to select, once you do that step, you remove the duplicates. Then, like for example, as you see, the initial search returned 4,634 papers. Then when I did title-based selection, so it came down to 748 papers. Then I removed duplicates, so it came down to 516 papers. Then I read the abstract of those 516 papers, so the number came down to 168 papers. Then I read the full text of those papers, and the number further came down to 69 papers. And then I did snowballing, which is a step that I went through the references of these 69 papers, and then from those references I picked 5 more papers that I also felt that these are relevant. So my final pool of papers was 74 papers, and this kind of comprehensive process of selection, it ensures that you do not miss any relevant paper. Step number 7, which is extraction of data from the papers. So I have collected these 74 papers, and now I need to extract relevant data against my research questions from these papers. So how this process works, you have the papers. The most important thing here is to design a data extraction form so that you can be clear in your head that what exactly I'm going to extract from these papers. Like in my case, what I did was that I collected the metadata, which is like the author, year, title, and so on. But most importantly, I collected like the items, for example, the big data processing framework, proposed technique, quality attributes, because these were the ones that were directly relevant to my research questions. So like nowadays there are far better tools to use. At that time when I did this review, I used to extract data and put it in an Excel sheet. Now, the last part is analyze and report data. What does this mean? It means that you have extracted the data. Now you need to understand and analyze the data to understand patterns, trends, and extract insights from the data. You also need to sort of, when you're analyzing, you need to look for research gaps, you need to look for new questions, you need to look for methodological improvements, that how those kind of, let's suppose in a specific field, how these studies can be conducted in a better way. How you can do that? For analysis of the data, there are again different methods. Like for example, thematic analysis, statistical methods, qualitative analysis, and so on. Like in my case, at that time, what I used was thematic analysis. And when using these methods, you need to look for implications. Now, one particular thing I would suggest you is that when I used to extract data, at that very time, I used to think about this particular aspect that, for example, if there is an insight, what would be the implications of this insight for researchers? What would be the insight of these implications for practitioners? If you leave it at the end, it becomes very difficult to sort of come up with solid implications. So when you are analyzing, extracting the data and analyzing, try to note down that, okay, for example, this is a good point, this is a good insight that can become a point for directing future research in this field. Okay, so now we take 5 seconds pause because we have finished the first part, which was about how to do literature review. Now, the second part is going to be focused on the different tools that we can use throughout this whole process to help us do this literature review.